The morning Marcus Caldwell learned his girlfriend was throwing a pool party without asking him. He was elbow-deep in a cow's infected hoof, his weathered hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who'd spent 37 years on the same 2,000-acre ranch. "Marcus, honey, I need to talk to you about something," Becca had said 2 weeks ago, her phone already in her hand, already scrolling through Pinterest, already planning. He'd known that tone, the tone that meant he'd already lost the argument before it started. She wanted to invite everyone, the entire social circle she'd cultivated since moving to Texas from California 6 months ago. The yoga instructors, the wine club members, the Instagram influencers she'd met at that wellness retreat in Hill Country. 40 people, maybe 50. It would be iconic, she'd said. A moment. Their house, his house, though she'd already started redecorating, would finally be known for something other than that ranch in the middle of nowhere. "The pool isn't even finished," Marcus had said, genuinely relieved by this technicality. "It will be in 2 weeks. I've paid the contractor extra." She hadn't looked up from her phone. He should have put his foot down then. Should have said no firmly, said it clearly, said it the way a man says it when he means it. Instead, he'd muttered something about needing to check on the herd and walked out to the barn, a move Becca had learned to interpret as surrender. Now standing in the treatment pen with old Bessie, a prize Angus who'd been with him since she was a calf, Marcus watched blood and iodine mix on the concrete floor. Bessie shifted her weight, and he murmured reassurance. "Don't worry, girl. Humans are the only species dumb enough to ignore their instincts," he said. His father's words came back to him, clear as if the old man were standing right there. Never marry someone who doesn't understand the land. They'll always see it as decoration. Becca had thrown a fit when he'd suggested keeping the cattle closer to the house during the party. "We'll move them," he'd said. "Rotational grazing anyway, perfect timing." "Absolutely not." She'd drawn herself up, all 5'7" of her stretched taller by indignation. "I don't want anything to do with those animals visible from the house. This party is about luxury and relaxation. It's about showing people that we belong here. We belong here." As if 6 months of weekends and renovations made this place hers. As if she'd spent 15-hour days in the Texas heat, fighting parasites and disease and market prices that never broke your way. The day of the party arrived blindingly hot. By noon, it was 103 degrees, the kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer and the cattle huddle in the shadow of the barn. Marcus had moved the herd to the south pasture, 200 head, roughly 6 miles from the house. It was farther than he liked to push them in this heat, but Becca had been clear. Non-negotiable. He should have moved them farther. Around 2 in the afternoon, the first cars started arriving. Teslas and Range Rovers and one absurd Lamborghini that had to navigate the dirt drive with painful slowness. Marcus watched from the barn as women in $1,000 sundresses climbed out, their shoes immediately sinking into red Texas dust. He found a grim satisfaction in it. "Why are you being such a dad about this?" Becca had asked that morning, finding him still in work clothes at 11 a.m. "I'm working," he'd said. "You're hiding." He hadn't bothered to correct her. Maybe she was right. By 3 o'clock, the party had reached full momentum. He could hear the bass from the barn, some DJ she'd hired, someone named Slash or Splash or something equally ridiculous. The smell of grilled shrimp and expensive perfume drifted across the property. Marcus sat in the barn's office with a cold beer, watching the property camera feed on his laptop. The pool glowed electric blue. Becca moved through the crowd like she'd been born to it, her white bikini and the pearl necklace he'd given her for her birthday making her look like money itself had taken human form. She looked beautiful. She looked like she belonged here. She looked like everything he'd been afraid of. His phone buzzed. A text from Jimmy Dale, his neighbor and closest thing he had to a friend out here. "Saw all the fancy cars heading your way. You need backup, or should I pretend I didn't see this coming?" Marcus smiled despite himself and texted back, "Still too early to say." By 4 o'clock, the heat had become genuinely dangerous. The thermometer on the barn read 106. The cattle in the south pasture would be stressed, clustered near the water tanks. He should check on them. He almost went multiple times. But he knew what Becca would say if he left, and he was tired of being the bad guy in his own life. He was tired of a lot of things. Around 4:45, the first sign of trouble arrived in the form of a phone call from Pete, his ranch manager. "Marcus, the fence on the south pasture, we've got a problem." Marcus sat up straight. What kind of problem? The kind where 60 head got loose about 20 minutes ago. I'm trying to round them back now, but in this heat, they're spooky. Anything loud or sudden, they're gonna bolt. The beer bottle slipped from Marcus's hand. The DJ must have cranked the music up. Even from the barn, Marcus could hear the heavy bass, the screaming electronic drops that the party guests were apparently losing their minds over. Perfect conditions for a cattle stampede. Where did they go? Marcus asked, already moving, already grabbing his keys. Heading north toward your property. Toward the house. Toward the party. Marcus didn't even think. He just moved, muscle memory and adrenaline overriding everything else. He was in his truck before he'd fully processed what was happening, and then he was driving, flying across the property toward the sound of that terrible, terrible music. He could see them even before he saw the party, a dark mass moving like oil through the grassland, eyes wild, horns catching the late afternoon sun. Bessie was at the front of the group, and that told him everything about how panicked they were. Bessie didn't panic. Bessie was the herd queen, steady and calm. Not today. The fence between the north pasture and the property was old, original to the ranch, post, and barbed wire that had held for 30 years. But it had been holding 60 calm cattle, not a stampede of frightened animals in 106-degree heat. The truck skidded to a stop. Marcus was out of it before it had fully stopped, waving his arms, trying to turn the herd, trying to guide them away from the house. But they didn't see him. They only saw escape, saw water, saw the chaos and the noise and the primal need to get away from a threat their animal brains couldn't process. The fence gave with a sound like breaking bones. And then Marcus was running toward the house, toward Becca, toward the disaster he'd known was coming because he'd known her for less than a year, and already understood that she was the kind of person who saw warnings as challenges to her imagination. The cattle burst through the northwest corner of the property like they were pursuing something, their massive bodies moving with a terrible grace that nature hadn't designed for refinement. They were running from fear, toward water, toward coolness, toward the electric blue rectangle that glowed in the middle of Becca's perfect backyard pool party. Bessie was the first to see it. She was a 1,400-pound Angus, and when she pivoted on her front left hoof and accelerated toward the pool, the 20-odd cattle behind her followed with the kind of herd mentality that Marcus's father had once described as a force of nature that doesn't give a damn about your property line. The DJ, his name was apparently Kai, and Marcus would later find out he charged $3,000 for a 4-hour set, saw them first. His hands flew off the turntables, and he let out a shriek that would have seemed more at home in a slasher film. He abandoned his equipment and bolted toward the house, leaving the music still playing, a feedback loop of bass line that only made the cattle more frantic. Becca was in the pool. She was standing in the shallow end, champagne flute in hand, mid-laugh at something one of her yoga instructor friends had said. The light hit her wet skin, and for just one frame of time, just one moment, she looked perfect. Happy, like she'd made the right choice in every decision that had led her to this exact moment. Then she saw the cattle. Her face went through a transformation that Marcus would replay in his mind for months afterward. First, confusion. What was that noise? What was that thundering sound? What was that dark mass approaching through the rose garden that the landscaper had cost her $4,000? Then recognition, dawning and terrible. Then pure, crystalline panic. "Get out of the pool," someone screamed. But Becca couldn't move. The champagne flute slipped from her hand and shattered on the pool deck. She stood frozen in water that suddenly seemed shallow as a puddle, watching a half-ton animal with curved horns accelerate toward her at 30 miles an hour. Bessie hit the shallow end of the pool like a missile. The water erupted. It wasn't like the movies. There was no elegant splash or graceful arc. It was a violent, chaotic explosion of chlorine and earth and animal panic. Bessie's back legs couldn't find purchase on the slick tile floor. She stumbled, her massive body going partially sideways, her horns sweeping through the space where Becca had been standing a half-second before. Becca had finally moved. She'd thrown herself toward the deep end, arms windmilling, and Bessie's horn whistled through the air behind her, close enough that Marcus could see from 50 feet away that it had cut her hair, actually severed a chunk of her dark blonde locks that floated impossibly on the pool's surface. Behind Bessie, the other cattle were coming. A Herefords jumped into the deep end like it was a watering hole. Two Angus bulls skidded on the pool deck, their hooves finding no purchase, and one went down hard on its side, bellowing. The second one jumped over it, over the cattle, over the pool chairs, over a woman in a blue two-piece who was trying desperately to scramble away. The crowd that had been dancing just minutes before was now scattered in pure chaos. A man in a white linen shirt tackled a woman, not maliciously, but in pure panic, both of them trying to move away from the animals. They went down together on the manicured lawn. An older woman was wading through the pool trying to reach the far edge, her jewelry tangled in the water. Someone's phone fell and cracked on the tile. Someone else was screaming their friend's name. Marcus was still running. He knew these animals. He knew their instincts, their fears, the specific way that panic moved through a herd like electricity. He was shouting, waving his hat, trying to turn them away from the house, toward the open ground beyond the property. But there were 12 of them in the pool area now, and more coming through the broken fence every second. One of the Angus bulls had spotted the party tent. It was white, expensive, the kind of rental that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. The bull, spooked beyond reason, charged straight through one of the support pillars. The entire structure wobbled, and then it was falling, sending tables and chairs and catering equipment scattering across the lawn. Champagne bottles went flying. The cake, a 4-tiered thing that must have cost $500, went down under a horse-sized animal's hooves. The destruction was absolute. And still they were coming. The south fence had held long enough, but the animals kept finding new pathways, new angles through the property. Marcus counted at least 30 now, scattered across different parts of the grounds. Some were still trying to get to the pool. Others had found the landscaped garden and were eating the rose bushes. One was methodically destroying the outdoor kitchen setup, its horns puncturing the stainless steel grill with dents that looked like violence. Becca had made it to the far side of the pool. She was pulling herself out of the water, gasping, her hair dripping, one side of her face red where it had come close to Bessie's horn. She looked like she'd been in a war. She looked like she'd finally understood something about the world, about this world, his world, that no amount of interior design could change. Marcus didn't have time to feel satisfied. He saw the gate to the back property was open, the one Becca had insisted they install so her friends wouldn't have to walk around the house. The cattle were flowing through it like water, spreading out across the property beyond. If he didn't get them contained, they'd be into the neighbor's ranch, and then Jimmy Dale would have something to actually complain about. "Come on," he shouted, more to himself than anyone else. "Come on, girl, that's right, keep moving." He was herding them now, using his voice and his body and 20 years of experience to turn the herd to establish a direction. Some of them were tiring. The heat had taken its toll, and the panic was giving way to exhaustion. He could work with that. Animals in heat exhaustion were more manageable than animals in pure panic. Around the far side of the house, toward the open ground where the grazing was better, where the animals could disperse without destroying anything else. Behind him, the party had turned into something between a disaster site and a crime scene. People were calling 911. Someone was trying to get Becca inside to check for injuries. The DJ's equipment was abandoned, still playing that same terrible electronic loop. And everywhere, were the scattered remains of what had been going to be an Instagram moment. Ruined decorations, overturned furniture, footprints in the manicured lawn, and the massive brown smears of cattle waste that were appearing with alarming frequency. It took Marcus 40 minutes to get the herd contained in the east pasture, where the fence was newer and held firm. He counted heads as they came through, 18 that had gotten loose, and thankfully all 18 accounted for. No serious injuries to the animals, though they were stressed and exhausted. The same could not be said for the party. When Marcus made his way back to the house, the sun was starting its descent. The shadows of late afternoon were stretching across the lawn, and in that golden, unforgiving light, the damage was stark and complete. The pool was brown. Not dirty brown or murky brown, but literally the color of earth and animal waste, the water no longer drinkable or swimmable. Dead leaves and flower petals floated on the surface. A pool lounger was somehow in the deep end, looking like a victim of some aquatic tragedy. The tent was completely destroyed. The grill had a hole punched through it. One of the decorative tree planters had been trampled, spilling dirt and broken pottery across the stone patio. The catering tables were overturned, food scattered. It looked like a tornado made of hooves had passed through. "And Becca," She was sitting on the back step of the house, wrapped in a robe Marcus didn't recognize, her wet hair dark against the fabric. The yoga instructor, the one named Crystal, was sitting next to her with one hand on her shoulder. Two paramedics were checking her vitals while someone from the fire department was filling out paperwork. The moment she saw Marcus, something in her expression shifted. It wasn't anger, it was worse than anger. It was the look of someone whose entire understanding of the world had just been rewritten in the space of 5 minutes. "We need to get you to the hospital," one of the paramedics was saying. "You have a laceration along your left hairline and you might have inhaled some contaminated water. Better to be safe." Becca nodded numbly. She didn't look at Marcus, not once. He stood there in his dusty work clothes, his hat still in his hand, and felt something inside his chest break, not loudly but completely. The way ice breaks under pressure, a sound too small for anyone else to hear, but the damage already done. Crystal finally noticed him. "The cattle, they came right through the fence, just came right through. We were lucky no one was seriously hurt." Marcus looked at the destruction around him, at the ruined property, at his girlfriend, his ex-girlfriend, he realized with absolute certainty, being helped into an ambulance. At the expensive cars leaving, their owners shaking their heads, their phones already recording videos that would be uploaded to social media within the hour. "Yeah," he said quietly, "lucky." The sun dropped lower, the light turned red. And Marcus Caldwell, who'd spent his entire adult life building and protecting and maintaining this ranch, stood in the middle of the destruction and didn't do anything to stop the tears that came. The hospital visit lasted 4 hours. Marcus didn't go. He stayed on the ranch, did what needed to be done, what he'd been trained to do since childhood. He checked on the cattle in the east pasture. They were settling, calming, their animal panic already receding into the background. He repaired the fence in the north pasture where it had failed. He documented the damage with his camera and his phone, taking pictures for the insurance claim he knew was coming. By the time Becca got home, driven by Crystal, who shot Marcus a look that could have melted steel, it was nearly midnight. She had a bandage on her left temple, a professional medical one that implied stitches underneath. Her left arm was in a sling, precautionary, the paramedics had said, but her shoulder had been wrenched when she'd thrown herself out of the water. She didn't speak to him. She walked into the house, his house, though she'd spent the last 6 months aggressively renovating it into something that didn't feel like his anymore, and closed the bedroom door. Not a slam. That would have been better. The quiet click of the lock engaging was somehow worse. Marcus sat on the back porch with a beer he didn't taste and waited for morning. It came cold and gray, with weather reports predicting a storm system moving in. When Becca emerged from the bedroom, she was already dressed in travel clothes. A suitcase was already at the door, neatly packed, efficiently handled. She'd clearly been planning this while he was outside dealing with the property destruction. "I'm going to stay with Crystal for a while," she said. Her voice was steady, not angry, not sad, not even particularly emotional, just factual the way a person reports the weather. "Becca, don't," she held up her uninjured hand. "Just don't. I'm not ready to talk about this yet, and honestly, I don't know if I'll ever be ready to talk about this." The fence was already compromised. We'd been meaning to reinforce it. This wasn't. "Your fault," she laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "No, Marcus, it was everyone's fault but yours, right? The fence, the heat, the cattle, me for wanting to have a party. Everything except the guy who told me to move the animals farther away but apparently didn't think that was important enough to actually do. I moved them 6 miles, but they still got out." He didn't have a response to that. She was right. He'd known they were spooked in the heat. He'd known that the fence was old. He'd let her overrule him when she shouldn't have, and then he'd made a half measure instead of a full commitment. He'd tried to keep the peace instead of keeping everyone safe. That was the worst part. He couldn't blame her, not really. He could only blame himself and the weakness that had let him say yes when he should have said no. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it." "I know." She picked up her suitcase. Crystal was waiting outside in her Land Rover, engine running. I can't be here right now. I can't look at this property and not see that moment where I almost died, where some animal with horns almost killed me." Bessie wouldn't have. Bessie was an animal doing what animals do. I understand that intellectually, but emotionally, she shook her head. I can't live here, Marcus. I can't wake up every morning looking out at the pastures where things like this can happen, where nature just ignores what you want and does whatever it wants anyway. That's what ranches are. That's what this life is. I know, and I can't be part of it. She moved toward the door, then paused. I think I need to move back to California. I was stupid to think I could change myself this much, that I could want the things you want just because I loved you. I don't belong here. I never did. He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her that people could change, that love was supposed to make you want to try. But he was looking at a woman who'd had a near-death experience, who'd been reminded viscerally that her money and her design aesthetic and her Instagram presence didn't mean anything when nature decided to roll through your carefully planned world. He was looking at someone who'd finally understood what he'd been trying to tell her since the day they met. "What about us?" he asked, and hated how small the question sounded. "There is no us," she said gently. "There's you and your ranch, and there's me and my life, and I finally understand that those two things are never going to fit together." She left before he could respond. Marcus watched through the window as she pulled away, Crystal's Land Rover disappearing down the dirt drive, red taillights vanishing into the morning gray. He stood there for a long time after they were gone, until the engine sound was completely absent, until the only thing he could hear was the wind and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pasture. The adjuster was a woman named Sandra Kemp, maybe 60 years old, with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent her entire career looking at damage and deciding what was and wasn't covered. She walked the property with Marcus, photographing the pool, the destroyed tent, the damaged landscaping, the ruined grill, and the $3,000 worth of catering that had been destroyed or contaminated. "Cattle damage," she said, making notes on her tablet. "This is going to depend on your policy and how it defines accidental livestock incursion." "It's on my property. They're my cattle. Shouldn't that be automatic?" "Not necessarily. If negligence is involved, if you failed to maintain the fences adequately, for example, that could be grounds for denial or reduced payment." Marcus had already retained a lawyer, a young guy named David Chen, who'd advised him to document everything, which he had. He'd photographed the fence in its pre-breach state. He'd documented the heat stress. He'd even tracked down Pete's hourly report about when the fence had failed and why. "The fence was original to the property," Sandra noted. 30 years old. Most policies consider that maintenance responsibility. "I was going to repair it. I had a schedule." "But you hadn't yet." He didn't respond. There was nothing to say. She was right. He'd been pushing the fence repair further and further down his priority list, always something more urgent, always another animal that needed attention, another bill that needed paying. In the end, the insurance paid for 70% of the damage. The fence was considered pre-existing infrastructure. The cattle were an act of God, they said, as if God had specifically intended for Bessie to demolish a luxury pool party. The total came to something close to $30,000 after the deductible. Marcus had the money, just barely. His father had left him a fairly substantial estate, and he'd been conservative with it, letting it sit in accounts, gathering dust and interest. But $30,000 was enough to sting, enough to require decisions. The pool could be cleaned and refilled. The landscaping could be replanted. The catering tent could be replaced. But the emotional damage, the understanding that his property could be invaded by forces he only partially controlled, the knowledge that his girlfriend had left because she'd finally seen his world for what it was, that couldn't be covered by any policy. Jimmy Dale came by 2 weeks after the incident, ostensibly to check on the repairs but really to say, "I told you so," in a kindly way. "Should have moved those cattle farther," he said, leaning against Marcus's truck. "Yes, I know. Should have put your foot down about the party." "Yeah, I know that too." "But you didn't, because you were trying to keep the peace with a woman who was never going to understand this life." Marcus looked at his neighbor, weathered face, hands that had spent 60 years working land, a marriage that had lasted 43 years because his wife, Jenny, had understood from day one that you don't fight the land, you work with it. "How'd you know she was going to leave?" Marcus asked. Jimmy Dale shrugged. "I've seen it before. Women coming out here thinking they're going to be some kind of ranch wife, thinking they'll fall in love with the sunsets and the wide open spaces. But the moment something goes wrong, a drought, a hard winter, a stampede at a pool party, They remember that they were never actually here for the land. They were here for the idea of the land, and the idea is a lot prettier than the reality. She loved me. She did, but love isn't enough when you're fundamentally incompatible with how someone wants to live. You can't love someone into wanting things they don't want, and she didn't want this. He gestured at the ranch, at the pastures and the fences and the massive animals that could turn on you at any moment, that could destroy your property and nearly kill you and not mean anything by it except that they were scared. Should I have let her have the party somewhere else? Marcus asked. Should I have fought harder? Maybe, or maybe this was always going to happen and it happened this way. Either way, you learned something and she learned something, and that's what life does. It teaches through experience. Jimmy Dale left him with a case of beer and a sad kind of finality. Marcus drank the beer slowly over the next week, sitting on his porch, watching the sky change colors, watching the cattle graze in the pastures like nothing had ever happened. Because from their perspective, nothing had. They'd panicked, they'd run, they'd drunk chlorinated water for a few minutes, and then they were back to doing what cattle do, eating grass, drinking from the tanks, existing without the burden of memory. 4 weeks after the party, Marcus was checking the north pasture when he noticed something odd. Bessie was favoring her left front hoof, the same one that had been infected before the party. He'd treated it, but apparently not thoroughly enough. In the stress and chaos, it had probably gotten reinfected. He called Pete. "Can you help me get her in?" he asked. "Yeah, the hoof that was bothering her before." "Same one." They worked for an hour to separate her from the herd and get her into the treatment pen. She was resistant. Cattle don't like being singled out, don't like the sensation of being captured. But Bessie was used to handling, used to the vet and the procedures, and she allowed it with a kind of resignation that only came from long experience with humans. When Marcus examined the hoof, he saw the problem immediately. The infection had spread deeper than he'd thought. The tissue around the sensitive structures of the foot was inflamed and discolored. She'd been walking on it for weeks, probably in significant pain, and there was real risk of permanent lameness. "This is bad," Pete said. "Yeah. You going to call the vet?" Marcus nodded. Dr. Reeves would have to come out and it wasn't going to be cheap, but Bessie was a valuable animal. She was the matriarch of his breeding program, the source of some of his best genetics. More than that, she was irreplaceable. Dr. Reeves came that afternoon. He was a compact man in his 50s, with the kind of quiet competence that came from 30 years of keeping large animals alive. He examined Bessie's hoof with the intensity of a jeweler examining a diamond. "How long has she been like this?" he asked. "Probably since around the time of the incident," Marcus admitted, "but I just noticed it favoring the hoof today." "She's been compensating, favoring the other hooves, adjusting her gait, smart animal." He looked up at Marcus. "The infection is pretty deep. I can give her aggressive antibiotics, but she's going to need box rest for at least a month. No grazing, minimal movement. This isn't something that's going to resolve quickly." "Will she recover?" "Probably, but there's a chance of permanent damage to the joint if the infection gets into the bone. We'll have to wait and see." The antibiotics cost $200 a shot, and Bessie needed them twice a week for 6 weeks. Marcus did the math and felt the cost accumulate like interest on a debt he'd never intended to incur. He set up a stall in the barn for Bessie, away from the herd, away from the grazing and the space she'd known her whole life. She paced for the first few days, agitated, wanting to be back with her animals. Marcus spent hours with her, grooming her, talking to her, trying to make the confinement less terrible. One evening, about 10 days into her recovery, Marcus was sitting in the barn late at night, something he found himself doing more and more, as if the solitude was the only thing that made sense anymore, when his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. "Hi Marcus, this is Becca. I got your number from my contact list. I'm back in California and I've been thinking about what happened. I wanted to reach out and apologize. I know the party was a disaster and I didn't handle the aftermath well. I'm sorry about everything. Becca." He read it 3 times, then he didn't respond. She texted again 2 days later. "I understand if you don't want to talk to me, but I wanted you to know that I've been going to therapy and I've been thinking a lot about our relationship and what happened. I was selfish and unrealistic about what your life is like. I pushed for the party and minimized your concerns, and when something went wrong, I blamed you for it instead of taking responsibility. I'm sorry." This time Marcus texted back, "It's okay. I'm glad you're doing better. Take care of yourself." She responded immediately, "I do hope you're okay too. What happened with Bessie and the other cattle after I left? I assume she was okay, right? I've been worrying about that ever since." He almost didn't tell her. He almost said they were all fine, let her have that comfortable fiction. But something made him answer honestly. "Bessie got an infection in her hoof during the incident. She's been on antibiotics for 3 weeks now. It's serious. She might have permanent damage." The response took a long time coming, long enough that Marcus thought the conversation was over. But then, "I'm so sorry, I didn't want anything to happen to the animals. I was just so scared and angry, and I didn't think about what the incident might have done to them. Can you tell me she's going to be okay?" He stared at that question for a long time. The honest answer was, "I don't know." The kind answer was yes. He split the difference. "I'm doing everything I can. We'll find out in a few weeks. Please let me know. I mean, I know we're not together anymore, but I do care about what happens to her." And he believed her. It was strange and complicated, but he believed that she genuinely cared about Bessie's recovery, cared enough to reach out to an ex-boyfriend to ask about it, cared even though she'd chosen to walk away from this life and everything in it. He sent her periodic updates after that, nothing extensive, just brief texts. "Bessie's doing better, eating well. The swelling is going down. Vet thinks she might be able to go back to limited grazing in another 2 weeks. Each time, Becca responded with genuine relief and encouragement. It was strange, having a more honest relationship with her now that they weren't together than they'd had while she was living on the ranch. 6 weeks after the party, Marcus stood in Bessie's stall and examined her hoof for the first time without the bandaging and wrapping. The swelling was nearly gone. The infection had cleared. The tissue was healing, pink and new, the kind of healing that suggested recovery was not just possible but probable. "She's going to make it," Dr. Reeves confirmed when he came for the final checkup. "The joint wasn't compromised. Another month of limited grazing and she should be fully recovered. You did good work, keeping her calm and getting her treated quickly." Marcus felt relief, so profound it almost knocked him over. By week 8, Bessie was back in the pasture with the herd. She moved carefully at first, testing her weight on the injured hoof, but within days she was grazing normally, interacting with the other cattle, being the matriarch again. The night she went back to the pasture, Marcus texted Becca, "Bessie's fully recovered. She's back with the herd." The response came within minutes. "I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you for telling me." And then a few minutes later, "I'm getting married. His name is David. He's a tech guy from San Diego. He understands me and doesn't need me to be something I'm not. I wanted you to know. I think you'll be happy with someone who actually belongs on that ranch with you, and I'll be happy with someone who belongs in the city. I'm sorry it took something catastrophic for us to figure that out, but I'm grateful we did." Marcus sat with that text for a long time. He should have felt sad or angry or some complicated combination of emotions. But what he actually felt was okay. Not sad, but not happy either. Just okay, the way a person is okay after they've survived something difficult and come out the other side knowing they'll be okay. He typed back, "I'm glad you found someone who makes you happy. I mean that." The autumn came mild that year. The heat broke in September and the rain came in October, and the land found its rhythm again. The pastures turned green. The cattle gained weight. The ranch settled into the kind of rhythm that Marcus loved, the kind that Becca had never quite been able to appreciate. The insurance eventually paid out in full after some back and forth with the lawyers. Marcus used the money to repair the fence properly, to upgrade the entire north pasture with new posts and better materials. He didn't replace the pool. He let it stay as it was, drained, empty, a monument to the difference between what people wanted and what the land allowed. Sometimes he thought about that moment when Becca had looked at him through the window of the ambulance, when the hospital lights had made her look like a stranger. He'd made his peace with the fact that she'd never understand his life, and she'd made her peace with the fact that she didn't belong in it. In November, 3 months after the party, Marcus went into town to pick up supplies. At the feed store, he ran into Jenny, Jimmy Dale's wife. She'd always been kind to him, always treated him like family. "How are you doing, honey?" she asked, the question carrying real concern. "Good, getting through it." "Jimmy said your girl left." "Yeah, it didn't work out." Jenny squeezed his arm. "The right person will understand. She'll understand that you can't change who you are or where you belong. and she won't want to. How'd you know? Marcus asked. How'd you know that Jimmy's life was going to be your life too? I grew up on a ranch, Jenny said simply. My daddy raised cattle just like Jimmy does, so when I met him, I wasn't falling in love with a stranger. I was falling in love with someone who lived the way I lived, who wanted the things I wanted. It made everything easier. On the drive back to the ranch, Marcus thought about that. About compatibility and understanding and the difference between loving someone and building a life with them. He thought about Becca in California, probably wearing a wedding dress that had cost more than some cattle, marrying someone named David who understood tech and city life, and all the things she actually wanted. He thought about his land, about Bessie grazing in the pasture, about the fences that held because he'd finally maintained them properly, about the storms that came and went and always left something different in their wake. And he made a decision. The next day, he contacted a realtor and put the house on the market. Not the ranch. He'd never sell the ranch, not for anything. But the big house that Becca had been redecorating, the one with the empty pool and the ruined landscaping, the one that had cost more money to maintain and felt less like a home every single day, that could go. He'd build something smaller on the ranch, something for himself. A cabin near the original homestead, maybe, something that didn't require constant updating and redesign, something that was honest about what it was. The house sold in December for slightly more than he'd paid for it. The buyers were a young family from Houston looking for a weekend retreat, and they were already talking about the parties they'd throw and the renovations they'd make. Marcus wished them luck. He meant it too. By spring, the cabin was nearly complete. It was small, just a bedroom, a kitchen, a living area with a big window that looked out over the pastures. There was a porch where Marcus would sit in the evenings and watch the cattle graze. There were shelves for his books and his father's books and the photo albums that documented generations of Caldwells working this land. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't Instagram-worthy, but it was honest and it was his. One afternoon in May, Marcus was checking a fence line when he saw a truck coming down the road. It was Jimmy Dale, and with him was a woman Marcus didn't recognize. Young, maybe his age, with the kind of face that suggested she'd spent time outdoors and the kind of posture that said she knew how to handle herself. "This is Sarah," Jimmy Dale said, introducing them. "She's a large animal veterinarian from Austin, just moved out to the area. I thought maybe the two of you might have something in common." Marcus nearly laughed at the setup, but he looked at Sarah, and she looked at him with an expression that was equal parts amusement and resignation about Jimmy Dale's obvious matchmaking, and he found himself saying, "Want to see the property?" They walked the ranch for 2 hours. Sarah asked smart questions about water management and grazing rotations. She knew cattle, had actually worked cattle, and didn't flinch when the herd moved toward them, curious. She looked at the cabin without any judgment about its size or rustic nature. She examined the fences and nodded approvingly at the upgrades. When they got back to the barn where Jimmy Dale was waiting with iced tea, Sarah said, "Your land is beautiful, and you're clearly doing right by your animals." "Thanks," Marcus said. "It's a good operation." "Yeah," she agreed. "It is." She came back the next week, then the week after that. Not romantically at first, just two people with similar interests in large animal health and land management. They talked about cattle breeds and veterinary procedures and the changing climate. Slowly, over the course of summer, it became something more, the kind of relationship that grew from genuine compatibility rather than physical attraction, though there was plenty of that too. By August, Sarah had moved her practice to be closer to the ranch. By October, she was spending more nights at the cabin than at her own place. By December, they were talking seriously about a future together, a future that included the ranch, included cattle, included the kind of life that Marcus had never quite been able to explain to Becca, but that Sarah understood intuitively. On the anniversary of the pool party, 1 year to the day, Marcus received a wedding invitation. It was from Becca. She and David were getting married in San Francisco. The invitation was beautiful and expensive and came with a handwritten note. "I'm thinking about you on this anniversary. I hope your life has gotten better since I left. I hope you found someone who understands. Take care of yourself. B." He didn't go to the wedding, but he sent a gift, a framed photo of the ranch taken during golden hour with Bessie in the foreground and the pastures stretching out behind her. On the back he wrote, "For your new home, best of luck to you both." To his surprise, Becca responded, It's beautiful. I cried when I opened it. I think part of me will always love that ranch, even though I know I could never live there. I'm glad you understand that some people are made for some places and some people aren't. I'm glad you finally have someone who is. B. And that was the end of it. Not the angry end, not the bitter end, but the kind of ending that comes when two people realize that loving each other wasn't enough to overcome the fundamental incompatibility of their needs. The ranch looks the same on the surface, the same pastures, the same fences, the same herd of cattle that are descended from the original stock. But there are differences too. The cabin has expanded into a real house, still small and practical, but with room for the family that Sarah and Marcus are discussing. The barn has new equipment. The grazing rotation has been optimized based on the latest research. And Bessie, now in her twilight years, still grazes in the south pasture. She's been bred many times over, and her genetics are scattered throughout the herd now, improving the stock, making the cattle stronger and healthier and more suited to the Texas climate. She doesn't remember the pool party. Cattle don't retain memories the way humans do. But the scar on her hoof, barely visible now, is a testament to what happened, to the moment when Marcus's world nearly fell apart and was saved by the very thing that had nearly destroyed it, the reality of the land itself. Sarah is pregnant now. They talk about what to teach their child, how to respect the land, how to work with animals, how to understand that nature doesn't care about your plans and your parties and your Instagram aesthetic. Sometimes, on hot summer days when the thunderstorms roll in, Marcus thinks about Becca. Not with regret anymore, not with longing, but with a kind of grateful acknowledgement. She taught him something important without meaning to, that you can't force someone to be part of your life if they don't want to be part of it, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let them go. The pool never got refilled. It's still there, empty, a kind of accidental sculpture to the day when nature reminded everyone who was really in charge. Last summer, Sarah had suggested turning it into something useful, maybe a water tank for emergency situations, or a shelter for animals in extreme heat. They're still deciding. But for now, it remains as it is, a reminder of that day when a woman tried to throw a pool party on a ranch, and the cattle had other plans. It's become a kind of local legend, actually. The story gets retold at the feed store and the county fair, gets embellished a little each time. The cattle getting bigger, the party getting fancier, the near miss getting closer. But the core truth remains. Sometimes you can't control what happens on your land, and sometimes the only way to survive is to understand that and work with it anyway. On the afternoon of the 5th anniversary, Marcus stood in the cabin he'd built and looked out at the pastures. Sarah was at the clinic. The baby, a son born 3 months ago, was sleeping in the crib that Marcus had built with his own hands, using wood from the old barn. Bessie was grazing in the distance, surrounded by her descendants, the matriarch still leading the herd even in her old age. And Marcus Caldwell, who'd lost something he thought he wanted and gained something he needed instead, smiled at the irony of it all.